Violet Harper tore the foreclosure notice in half with both hands, let the pieces fall at Gerald Fitch's feet, and looked him dead in the eyes without blinking. Every woman in Blackwater Ridge had warned her, a woman alone, a woman too fierce, a woman too wild would never survive this frontier. She had smiled at every single warning. She was still smiling now, even with the bank trying to swallow everything her father had bled to build. Tell Blackwell he picked the wrong woman. Her voice was quiet. Quiet the way Montana goes quiet before a storm that levels everything in its path. I don't break. I never learned how. If this is your first time here, welcome, and if you've been with us before, you already know we don't tell small stories on this channel. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because this one is going to change the way you think about what it means to be too much for the wrong person, and exactly right for the one who matters. The summer of 1884 came to Blackwater Ridge, Montana, the way it always did: hot, unforgiving, and without apology. The kind of heat that cracked leather and split wood and made grown men sit in the shade and do nothing for hours at a time. The kind of summer that tested everything a person was made of and exposed every crack they had been hiding since winter. Violet Harper had been hiding cracks for 3 years. Not because she was weak. Anyone who had ever watched her work would have laughed at that suggestion. Violet Harper was 25 years old, lean and sun-bronzed and sharp-eyed, and she could outwork most of the men in Blackwater Ridge before the noon bell rang. She could read weather in the color of a morning sky. She could tell by the way a horse held its ears whether the animal was spooked or simply tired. She had learned those things from her father, Thomas Harper, who had spent 30 years carving a working cattle ranch out of raw Montana wilderness with nothing but stubborn hands and a refusal to quit. Thomas Harper had been dead for 3 years, and Violet had spent every single day of those 3 years fighting to keep what he built from being swallowed by the people who believed it should never have been hers to begin with. She was hiding cracks because she couldn't afford to show them. Not here. Not in a town where everyone was already waiting for her to crack wide open. The morning it all came to a head started like any other. Violet was up before dawn, the way she always was, pulling on her work boots in the gray half-light, while the ranch hands, who remained on her payroll, 3 men, down from the 9 her father had once employed, were stirring in the bunkhouse. She had coffee on the stove and a list in her head that was longer than the day would allow, and she was already calculating which problems could wait, and which ones would ruin her if she let them sit another 24 hours. The fence along the north pasture, the payment due to the feed supplier in town, the letter from the bank that had arrived 2 days ago, and that she had read 4 times and still hadn't answered because she didn't know how to answer it without showing her hand. The letter was sitting on the kitchen table when she walked past it. She didn't look at it directly, the way you don't look directly at something that frightens you when you haven't yet decided what to do about it. She drank her coffee standing up and walked out into the morning. Miss Harper. It was Roy Cassidy, the oldest of her remaining hands, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for her father before he worked for her. He was standing by the barn door with his hat in his hands, and she knew from the way he was holding it, turning the brim from slowly between his fingers, that something was wrong. Roy, she stopped walking. Say what you came to say. He looked at the ground. Ed Greer and Pete Hollis gave their notice last night. She felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. 2 more men. That left Roy and 1 other. A young hand named Danny who was 16 and still learning which end of a hammer to hold. They say why. Roy kept his eyes down. Ed said his wife told him it wasn't right, working for a woman-run outfit. Said it made him look, he used the word soft. Violet said nothing for a long moment. She looked out past Roy's shoulder at the north pasture, at the line of fence she could see, was already leaning wrong in 2 places. And what did you tell them? She asked. Roy finally looked up. I told them Thomas Harper built something worth respecting, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He paused. They left anyway, all right, she said. Her voice was even. Flat. The voice she had learned to use. when something hurt badly enough that she couldn't afford to let it show. All right, we manage with what we have. She turned and walked toward the north pasture, and she did not let Roy see her face until she had it under control again. She spent the morning alone on that fence, the sun climbing fast and merciless overhead. Driving posts with a mallet that was too heavy for one person to work efficiently, and digging out rotted wood with a pry bar that left blisters on both palms within the first hour. She worked with her jaw set and her mind empty of everything except the next post, the next hole, the next section of wire to be tightened and tested. She was 3 sections into it when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She didn't look up right away. She had learned that looking up too quickly at strange hoofbeats made you look startled, and Violet Harper did not look startled. She finished the post she was working, set the mallet down, and then straightened and looked. There was a man on the road, a rider she didn't recognize, sitting a good horse easily the way men do when they've spent more years in a saddle than out of one. He had slowed his horse to a walk, and was looking at her work with an expression she couldn't quite read at that distance. "That corner brace is going to pull loose before winter," he said. She looked at him. "Excuse me?" He nodded toward a section of fence she hadn't reached yet. "The angle's wrong on the brace post. The wire tension's going to work it loose once the ground freezes. You'll lose the whole line by March." Violet looked at the brace post. Then she looked back at the man. He was right. She had known it was wrong, and had been telling herself she would fix it properly once she got to that section. It was the kind of small defeat she had been absorbing daily for months, knowing something needed doing the right way and doing it the fast way instead, because she didn't have enough hands or enough hours. "So I know that," she said, just mentioning it. He didn't make it sound like a criticism. He said it the way a person mentions weather as a fact, without judgment. "Are you passing through, or do you have business in Blackwater Ridge?" "Looking for ranch work," he said. "Heard this area might have opportunities." "Who told you that?" "Man at the last town I came through. Said the Harper outfit was hiring." "I haven't posted for work," she said carefully. He shrugged. Maybe he heard wrong. He studied her for a moment. "You're the owner?" "I am." Something shifted in his expression. Not the reaction she was used to, the slight pull of surprise followed by doubt, the reassessment, the barely hidden condescension. He just nodded like she had told him something reasonable. "Name's Caleb Westwood," he said. "Violet Harper." He looked at the fence line stretching ahead of her, at the mallet on the ground, at her blistered hands. "You're doing this alone," he said. "I'm aware of that. I could finish this line today." He looked at her steadily. "No commitment from either of us. One day's work. See if it makes sense to talk further." She studied him for a long moment. Caleb Westwood looked to be in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and unhurried. He had the kind of face that had spent years being tested by weather and had come out plain and honest on the other side of it. She had learned not to trust faces. She had learned not to trust much of anything that presented itself as convenient. "I pay fair wages," she said. "Not generous. Fair is fine. You work for me, you take direction from me. Not from Roy, not from anyone else on this property. From me." He met her eyes. Understood. She picked up the mallet and held it out to him. "Then start at that corner brace, and do it properly." The town of Blackwater Ridge had opinions about Violet Harper, the way it had opinions about weather. Everyone had one. Nobody agreed entirely, and they discussed it endlessly in the spaces between doing anything useful. Margaret Howell, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and considered herself the social conscience of the community, had been saying for 3 years that Violet Harper was heading for ruin and taking her late father's good name down with her. Margaret had 3 daughters and had raised all 3 of them to understand that a woman's value lived in her reputation, her household management, and her willingness to defer to the men who knew better. Violet Harper offended every principle Margaret held dear, and she offended it loudly and without apparent remorse. She rode into town last Tuesday. In those work pants again, Margaret told her circle of friends over afternoon tea, in the particular tone she used, for things she found simultaneously horrifying and irresistible to discuss. Pants. Like a man, with mud on her boots, going right into the feed store, talking to Horace Tanner like she had every right to be there. "She does have every right," said Clara Weston quietly. Clara was newer to town, a widow who ran a small seamstress operation and had learned to keep her opinions small in Margaret's company. "That is not the point," Margaret said. "The point is appearances. The point is that no decent man will court a woman who can't bother to dress like one. And what happens to the Harper ranch when she finally has to sell it? Where does she go then? Has she thought about that?" Clara looked at her tea. "Perhaps she doesn't want to be courted." Margaret put down her cup. "Every woman wants to be courted, Clara. They just tell themselves otherwise when the alternative is too frightening to face. The thing about rumors in a small town is that they don't stay still. They move. They pick up details as they travel from mouth to mouth, the way a stone rolling downhill picks up mud and momentum, until by the time they complete their circuit, they are heavier and faster, and far more destructive than whatever small truth started at them. The truth that had started the rumors about Violet Harper was this: she was different. She had always been different. Even as a girl, she had been the one, racing her horse along the ridge road when the other girls were practicing needlework. She had been the one asking her father questions about cattle prices and land deeds and water rights when the other girls were learning to pour tea. Thomas Harper had answered every question. He had treated her education as seriously as he had treated the Tran accounts, because Thomas Harper was a practical man, and he understood that Violet would one day inherit everything he had, and she would need to know how to hold it. He had not expected to die at 52 from a heart that gave out without warning on a Tuesday morning in November 3 years ago, while he was walking from the barn to the house. He had not had time to prepare anyone for what came next. What came next was Violet, standing in the bank 2 weeks after her father's funeral, reading through the terms of the ranch's existing loan with careful attention to every clause, and telling the bank manager that she intended to continue operations and would meet her payment schedule. The bank manager, whose name was Gerald Fitch, had looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that she would never entirely forget, not hostile, not cruel, but deeply uncertain, as though her presence in that chair represented a category of problem he had never been trained to address. "Miss Harper," he had said carefully, "your father's loan carries terms that were negotiated with a particular operational plan in mind. We would want to be assured that the ranch's capacity to service that debt would be maintained. The ranch is operational," she had said. "I have 9 ranch hands. I have a full cattle complement. I understand the payments, and I will meet it. Of course." He had folded his hands on the desk. "We would simply want to ensure, given the circumstances, that you have considered all your options, including the possibility of a sale. There are several interested parties who might offer very favorable terms." She had looked at him for a long moment. "My father built that ranch from nothing," she had said. "I was there for all of it. I'm not selling." Gerald Fitch had nodded and smiled, the particular smile of a man who expects to have the same conversation again in 6 months, under worse conditions, and is prepared to be patient. He hadn't been wrong about the worse conditions part. The 6 months had stretched to 3 years, and the conditions had gotten considerably worse. Not because Violet lacked the knowledge or the capability, but because the world around her kept removing the scaffolding while she was still building. The ranch hands left one by one. Some left because other outfits were paying more that she could accept, because she understood economics. Some left because their wives and pressured them to work for a more conventional employer. Some left because Edward Blackwell, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had wanted the Harper land since before Thomas Harper was cold in the ground, had been quietly letting it be known that working for Violet Harper was a form of professional disadvantage that sensible men would do well to avoid. She didn't know about Blackwell's interference yet. She would find out, but not today. Today she watched Caleb Westwood fix the corner brace, properly digging the post deeper, resetting the angle, retightening the wire with a patience and thoroughness that she recognized as the work of someone who didn't do things twice. She stood back and let herself breathe for the first time in a week. "Where are you from?" she asked, when the work had reached a natural pause. "Texas, originally. Worked ranches across New Mexico, Colorado, up into Wyoming. He checked the tension on the wire with his hand. I don't stay in one place long. Why not? He considered the question seriously, which surprised her. Most men would have given a quick, uncomplicated answer. Caleb seemed to actually think about it. Most places, I stay until the work is done. Then there's no reason to stay. What does done mean to you? He looked at her. It was a direct look, not uncomfortable but not evasive either. I'm still working that out. Roy Cassidy watched Caleb Westwood work for the rest of that afternoon and came to a quiet conclusion by the time the sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline. He'd seen a lot of hands come through the Harper ranch. He'd seen the ones who worked well and the ones who didn't, and he'd learned to tell the difference inside the first hour. Caleb Westwood worked without waste, no extra movement, no standing around, studying the problem when the problem was already clear, no looking to see who was watching him. He just worked. You've done this before, Roy said, when they were pulling the last section of wire. Done a lot of things before, Caleb said. Roy studied him. Where'd you hear about the Harper outfit, really? We haven't posted for hands. Caleb pulled the wire taut before he answered. I heard in Billings that there was a ranch operation being squeezed out by a big outfit that didn't want to compete fairly. Heard the owner was fighting it. He wrapped the wire end. Figured that was the kind of operation that might need an experienced hand. Figured I might want to see it for myself. Roy was quiet for a moment. And what do you think, now that you've seen it? Caleb looked toward the barn, where Violet had disappeared an hour ago to deal with something Roy hadn't caught the details of. I think a lot of people have put a lot of effort into convincing this place it should fail, he said. That's interesting to me. Interesting how? Most things worth having have people working against them. He picked up his tools. The question is, whether the person at the center of it has what it takes to hold on. Roy followed his gaze toward the barn. She does, he said. There was no qualification in his voice. That girl has more of what it takes than anyone I've known, her father included. And Thomas Harper was a good man. Then she needs people who can see that, Caleb said simply. Violet was in the barn when she heard the voices from the yard outside, Roy's low and measured, and another voice she placed as belonging to Gerald Fitch's assistant from the bank, a young man named Theodore who delivered correspondence that was too sensitive, apparently, to trust to the post. She came out of the barn with hay on her sleeve and her face already composed. Theodore looked uncomfortable in the way that young men do when they have been assigned a task they would prefer someone else had taken. Miss Harper, he said with more formality than was natural for a 20-year-old. Mr. Fitch asked me to deliver this personally. He held out an envelope. She took it. Thank you, Theodore. She opened it right there, because not opening it would have looked like fear, and she refused to look afraid in front of anyone. She read the contents once, then folded the letter and held it loosely at her side. Tell Mr. Fitch I received it, she said. Theodore nodded and left quickly, apparently relieved. Roy was watching her. Caleb was watching her too, from a respectful distance, though she noted that he didn't look away when she glanced at him. He didn't pretend he hadn't noticed. What is it? Roy asked. She thought about lying. She thought about saying it was nothing, because Roy had enough to worry about and she was the one who was supposed to have answers, not more questions. Instead, she looked at the letter in her hand. The bank has moved up the payment deadline by 30 days, she said. They're calling it a routine administrative adjustment. Her voice was steady. It isn't. Roy's jaw tightened. They can, she said. I read the loan agreement 3 years ago, and I've read it 17 times since. There's a clause. She paused. There's always a clause. Miss Harper, I need to think, she said. She folded the letter again and put it in her pocket. We finish the fence line before dark, then I think. She walked back toward the section they hadn't completed yet. After a moment she heard footsteps behind her, not Roy's familiar shuffling walk, but a steadier, more measured tread. She didn't turn around. You don't have to help any further, she said. I told you one day's work, that was the offer. I know what the offer was, Caleb said. He picked up the mallet. The situation here is more complicated than it looked this morning. Most situations are. She stopped walking and turned around. He met her eyes without flinching. Why would you want to walk into this? She asked. Not angry, genuine. She wanted to understand his calculation. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for a comfortable lie, but the quiet of someone deciding how much truth to offer. "I've worked for big outfits," he said. "Outfits that win by making sure nobody else can. I've watched what they do to small operations that are in their way." He looked at the fence line. "I've never felt good about being on the side that does the squeezing." "You don't know that's what's happening here." "No," he agreed. "But I know that letter you just got didn't come from nowhere. And I know that a woman who builds a ranch fence alone in the Montana heat, when she's got hands enough to burn, isn't struggling because she doesn't know how to work." He held her gaze. "She's struggling because someone wants her to." Violet Harper had been holding herself together with wire and will for 3 years. She had gotten very good at it. She had become, in fact, almost supernaturally good at it, to the point where she sometimes forgot that holding together was not the same as being whole. She stood there in the fading afternoon light with a strange cowboy who had materialized out of nowhere and somehow said in 90 seconds what no one in 3 years had said to her, not the truth about the situation, which she already knew, but the acknowledgement that the situation was not her fault. She looked at him for a long moment. "The corner brace," she said finally. "Show me what you did differently, so I can do it myself next time." He nodded. Fair enough, and he showed her. That night, after Caleb Westwood had accepted the offer of the empty bunk in the hands' quarters and Roy had locked up the barn, Violet sat at her kitchen table with the letter from the bank, a cup of cold coffee, and a ledger that told her the truth in numbers more clearly than anything else could. The numbers were not kind. She had 30 days now, thanks to the bank's administrative adjustment, to come up with a payment that was going to require either selling stock she couldn't afford to lose or taking out additional financing that would only deepen the hole she was standing in. She had 2 ranch hands, one of them a 16-year-old boy. She had cattle that were healthy, and a property that was sound, and a knowledge of this land that no one could take from her. And she had, apparently, a stranger who had shown up on her fence line and quietly, without fanfare, decided to help. She didn't know what to make of Caleb Westwood. She had learned to be careful about people who appeared at convenient moments. Her father had trusted too freely, and some of that trust had been exploited. She carried that lesson the way you carry a scar. It didn't cripple her, but it changed the way she moved through the world. Still, there was something about the way he'd said it. She's struggling because someone wants her to. She hadn't told him about Edward Blackwell. She hadn't told him about the gradual pressure, the whisper campaign, the hands who left under circumstances that never quite felt fully voluntary. She hadn't told him any of it, and he'd known anyway. Or at least, he'd known enough. She closed the ledger. She put the letter in the wooden box where she kept documents that required action. She washed her cup and set it upside down on the drying rack. At the window she paused. The night was full and still, and the stars were sharp above the Montana plain. The kind of sky that her father had loved, and that she had grown up taking for granted before she understood what it cost to be the person standing under it, trying to keep something alive. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. The cool surface grounded her. She was not going to lose this ranch. She was not going to give Gerald Fitch his tidy conclusion, or Edward Blackwell his land, or the town of Blackwater Ridge the satisfaction of watching Violet Harper come apart, the way they had always expected she would. She was going to figure this out. She went to bed. And in the bunk in the hands' quarters, Caleb Westwood lay looking at the ceiling, with his hands behind his head, already thinking about the fence line, the corner brace angle, the lay of the land he'd ridden across that afternoon. Thinking, too, about the look on her face when she read that letter. The way she had folded it and held it and kept her voice absolutely level. He had known a lot of people in his years of moving from place to place, from ranch to ranch, across the width of the American West. He had worked alongside men who were brave, and men who were cowardly, and men who were something in between, and he had learned to read the difference quickly. It was a survival skill. He had not worked alongside many women. The frontier didn't offer the opportunity, as a general rule. But he had known enough of them, his mother, his older sister, women at ranches and trading posts and frontier towns, to understand that the particular kind of strength that lived in Violet Harper was not common. Most people, when the ground started crumbling underneath them, grabbed for anything they could reach. They panicked. They made desperate decisions that made things worse. Violet Harper had read a letter that should have broken her composure, folded it, put it in her pocket, and said, "We finish the fence line before dark." He thought about that for a while. Then he stopped thinking and went to sleep, because there was work to do in the morning. The next morning, before the rest of the ranch was awake, Violet had already been to the north pasture and back. She had counted cattle, checked water, assessed the fence repair, and was in the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, and her ledger opened to a new page when Caleb appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw she was working. "Should I come back?" "Sit down," she said without looking up. "Coffee's on the stove." He poured himself a cup and sat across the table, without being invited to specifically, but without presuming either, just finding the natural place and settling into it. She looked up. "You said last night you've worked outfits across Wyoming and Colorado. And New Mexico, some in Kansas. You said you've worked cattle operations that get squeezed out by bigger ones. I've seen it happen more than once." She turned the ledger to face him and pushed it across the table. "Then look at this and tell me what you see." He looked at her for a half second, possibly surprised, possibly not, then pulled the ledger toward him and read. He was quiet for a long time. He turned pages. He went back to earlier entries. He did not make noise to show he was engaged. He simply read. "You're understaffed for your cattle count by about 30%, he said finally. "Your feed costs are higher than they should be, which means either your supplier is charging a premium or your feed efficiency is off. The payment timeline is aggressive for a ranch this size even in a good year." He looked up. "And it's not a good year." "No," she agreed, "it's not." "Who's the other pressure coming from?" "Because the bank doesn't tighten timelines on its own." She held his gaze. "You notice that too? A bank adjusts terms when someone of influence suggests it would be in everyone's best interest," he said. "That's not a bank making an independent financial decision. Someone put weight on that, a man named Edward Blackwell. Big outfit, largest in the county. He's wanted this land since my father was alive." She folded her hands on the table. "He's never made an overt move. It's always pressure from a comfortable distance. Hands who find better offers elsewhere. Suppliers who are suddenly out of stock. Letters from the bank with administrative adjustments." Caleb set down the ledger. He looked at her steadily. "He thinks you'll break before he has to do anything actionable," he said. "He thinks I'll decide the fight isn't worth it," she corrected. "He thinks I'll eventually accept a sale offer and convince myself it was my own idea." She paused. "He doesn't know me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think he does." Something shifted between them in that moment, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. The kind of shift that happens when two people realize they are looking at the same situation from the same angle and arriving at the same conclusion. "I want to offer you a position," Violet said. "Permanent, or as close to permanent as I can offer given the circumstances. Competitive wages, room and board." She met his eyes. "I need someone who can help me run this operation at full capacity and help me figure out how to do it with the resources I have. You need more than one hand. I know that. I'm working on it." She paused. "Will you stay?" He didn't answer immediately. She had expected that, and she respected it. A man who agreed too quickly to a difficult situation either didn't understand it or was agreeing for reasons that had nothing to do with the situation's merit. He looked out the window at the morning light coming in over the pasture. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She waited. "When I came through Billings, I mentioned I heard about a ranch being squeezed out by a big operation." He looked back at her. "What I didn't say is that I've had dealings with Edward Blackwell before. Not with him directly, with an outfit he was connected to down in Colorado. I watched what they did to a family there." He set his coffee cup down. "I didn't stay long enough to be any help. That's something I've thought about since." Violet studied him. "So this isn't just about ranch work," she said. "No," he admitted. "Not entirely." She considered that. "Another woman, perhaps, would have found it troubling, an agenda, a complication. Violet Harper found it unexpectedly clarifying. "Then we understand each other," she said. "You're not here just for wages. I'm not just looking for a hand. We both want the same outcome. The ranch survives," he said. "Blackwell doesn't get what he wants," she added. "And you don't lose what your father built." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the ledger and turned it back toward her side of the table. "Then let's figure out how to do it," she said. Outside, the morning was full and golden, and the cattle were beginning to move in the north pasture, and in the kitchen of the Harper Ranch, two people who barely knew each other began the hard and careful work of learning to trust. And in the town of Blackwater Ridge, people were just beginning to wake up and start their day, including, in the large and comfortable house on the east edge of town, Edward Blackwell, who was eating his breakfast and feeling entirely comfortable about how things were going. He had no reason yet to think about Violet Harper this morning. He would, before long he would think about her quite a lot. But that was still ahead of him, for now, the woman everyone had given up on was sitting at her kitchen table, with a stranger who had shown up on her fence line, and somehow already understood exactly what she was fighting. She didn't know yet what that would mean. She didn't know yet what either of them was capable of. But she was about to find out. The first week Caleb Westwood worked the Harper Ranch, he said very little and did a great deal, and Violet watched him the way she watched everything on her property with the careful, measuring attention of someone who has learned that the gap between what a person promises and what they actually deliver is where all the real information lives. He was up before she was every morning, which she discovered on the third day when she came out at first light and found the horses already fed and watered and the barn swept. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, looking at the clean floor and the contented horses and feeling something she couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and irritation, because she had a system and she hadn't asked him to adjust it. She found him at the water trough, checking a fitting that had been leaking slowly for 2 weeks. "I have a list," she said, "for each day. I'd like to be consulted before items are added or reordered." He looked up from the fitting. "Fair enough. I'll ask tomorrow." "You'll ask today. What else did you do before I was up?" He told her, without defensiveness, the way he told her most things directly, with no padding around the edges, to soften the information or make it more palatable. He had checked the fence line they'd repaired, found one section that was already pulling loose because the ground underneath had more moisture than it looked, and reset the post before it could cause a problem. He had also noticed that one of the older steers was favoring his left front leg and had separated him from the herd. She walked to the holding pen and looked at the steer. Then she looked at Caleb. "You know cattle," she said. "I know cattle," he agreed. "You should have told me about the steer before you moved him." "You're right, he meant it. I acted on instinct. I'll hold off on independent decisions." She studied him. "You don't sound like a man who finds that easy." "I don't," he said simply. "But it's your operation." She nodded and turned back to the steer. "His name is Augustus. My father named all the breeding stock." He said it helped him remember they were individuals and not just numbers. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like a man worth knowing." He was. She crouched down and examined the steer's leg with practiced hands. He was the kind of man who gave everything he had to everything he touched. The ranch, his family, she ran her fingers along the leg carefully. He believed that how you treated things that couldn't speak for themselves was the truest measure of a person's character. "He taught you well." She stood. "He taught me everything." She brushed her hands on her trousers. "Augustus has a soft tissue strain. He'll need 3 weeks off the range. There's a salve in the back of the barn on the middle shelf in a blue tin. Apply it morning and evening." "I'll do it," Caleb said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she handed him the responsibility the way she handed out all responsibilities, cleanly, without ceremony, with the implicit understanding that it would be done correctly and she would not have to revisit it. She went back to her list. That evening, she found Augustus with fresh salve applied and a small amount of grain set beside the water in his pen, which she hadn't specified, but which was exactly the right call for an animal recovering from muscle strain. She stood at the pen fence for a moment in the late light and let herself feel, briefly, the unfamiliar sensation of something having been done well, without her having to do it herself. It was not a feeling she had experienced much in 3 years. She didn't say anything about it to Caleb, but she recalibrated something quietly, in the part of her mind where she kept her running assessments of people. She upgraded him from provisionally useful to genuinely capable. They were different categories. Very few people made it to the second one. Roy Cassidy noticed. Roy noticed most things, which was part of why Violet had kept him on even during the months when the wages had required creative accounting to produce. He came to her at the end of that week while she was going over the ledger at the kitchen table, and he sat down across from her in the way he'd had since she was a little girl, not asking permission, but also not making it a challenge. Just sitting the way family does. That Westwood fella, he said. What about him? He's good. I know better than good. He's the kind of hand you build an operation around. Roy turned his hat in his hands. Where'd he really come from, Miss Harper? She looked up from the ledger. He told me straight. He came through Billings and heard about the situation here. He had his own reasons for wanting to see it. What reasons? He's had dealings in the past with operations connected to Blackwell. He watched a family in Colorado lose their land and didn't do anything to help. She paused. He said it was something he'd thought about since. Roy was quiet for a moment. A man with a conscience, he said finally. Those are either the most reliable people you'll ever meet or the most dangerous, depending on how well their conscience is calibrated. I know that, and you've decided which kind he is? She looked back at the ledger. I've decided he's useful. I haven't decided anything beyond that. Roy nodded slowly. Just so you know, Danny thinks he's the greatest man who ever lived. The boy followed him around for half the morning, watching him work on the waterline. Violet almost smiled. Danny thinks the postmaster is fascinating because he has a beard. That's true, Roy agreed. But Westwood showed him how to splice a wire connection properly, and the boy actually listened. That's different. He stood, I'm just saying. He's good for more than fence work. She knew that. She had known it since the second morning. What she hadn't decided was how far to trust it, and that was a different question entirely. The answer came faster than she expected. It was 10 days after Caleb had arrived when Violet went into town for supplies, and came back knowing that everything she'd been quietly building was under more direct threat than she had realized. She'd gone to the feed store first, then to the hardware, and then, because she needed to speak with Gerald Fitch about the adjusted payment deadline, to the bank. Gerald Fitch had not been available. His assistant, Theodore, had been apologetic and vague in equal measure, which was its own kind of information. Violet had pressed, politely and then less politely, and Theodore had eventually admitted that Mr. Fitch was in a meeting with Mr. Blackwell and that he didn't know when it would conclude. She had left without making a scene, because making a scene in Gerald Fitch's bank would have given people exactly the story they wanted. She had walked to her wagon with her back straight and her face composed, and she had driven the full 12 miles back to the ranch with her hands steady on the reins and her mind working fast and cold. Blackwell was in Fitch's office, not unusual in itself. They were both men of business in a small community, and they had reason to interact. But combined with the payment timeline adjustment, combined with everything she already knew, it stopped being coincidence and became pattern. She told Caleb when she got back. She wasn't sure, afterward, why she did it so immediately, why she didn't go over it herself first, the way she usually processed things, alone at her kitchen table, with her ledger and her own counsel. She pulled the wagon up to the barn, and Caleb came out to help with the supplies. And before she had thought about whether it was the right decision, she had told him everything she'd seen and heard and concluded. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was echoed for a moment. Then he said, he's moving up the timeline because something changed. He's gotten impatient, that's what I think too. Which means something happened to make him impatient. Either someone told him you're in better shape than he thought, or someone told him you were getting help. She looked at him. Me, he said. It wasn't a question. Someone saw you on the property. Someone would have mentioned it in town. Word that the Harper Ranch has a new hand. She stopped. He doesn't know who you are. No, Caleb said, he wouldn't. But he knows something has changed, and he doesn't like uncertainty. She looked at the supplies in the wagon. He's going to push harder, then we move faster. She looked at him. The payment, he said. What do you need and how much time do we have? She told him the number. She watched his face for the reaction. Most people had the slight drawing back, the reassessment, the unconscious calculation of personal risk. She had told Roy the number 2 weeks ago, and Roy had gone quiet for 2 full minutes before saying they would figure it out. Caleb heard the number and said, "That's achievable. It's going to require selling some stock, I know. But if I sell the wrong animals, I hurt the herd's capacity for next year. So we sell carefully." He leaned against the wagon. "You know this herd. Tell me which animals you can move without compromising next season's numbers." She told him. They stood there beside the wagon in the afternoon heat, going through it together, and she was aware, in a way that was new to her, of how different this felt from going through it alone. Not easier, the numbers were still what they were, the problem was still what it was. But having someone who could follow the reasoning, who could push back when something didn't add up, who could spot the places where her own exhaustion was making her conclusions softer than they should be. "That steer you want to sell," he said, pointing to a line in her mental accounting. "The one with the good build and the short history. How much do you think you can get for him?" "40 if I'm lucky." "Maybe 35. Hold him another month. He'll bring 60. She looked at him. "I don't have a month, I know. I'm saying if we find another way to bridge the gap, that steer is worth more than you're valuing him." He met her eyes. "Don't take what you have to take. Take what's smart to take, and find another way for the rest." She held his gaze. "What other way?" He was quiet for a moment. "Let me make some inquiries. I know some buyers who operate independently from the usual channels. Men who buy and sell on merit, not on community pressure. Blackwell has influence with most of the buyers in this region." "Most," Caleb agreed. "Not all." She looked at him for a long moment. "If you use your connections for this, you become more visible. You become part of the situation in a way that might cause problems for you." He met her eyes and held them. "I'm already part of the situation," he said. "I decided that when I rode in, there it was again, that thing she couldn't quite categorize. The straightforward claiming of a position that most people would have hedged, or qualified, or surrounded with conditions. He was part of it, simply, without negotiation." She turned back to the wagon. "Make your inquiries," she said carefully. "Always." The inquiries took 3 days, and while Caleb made them quietly through channels that Violet didn't ask him to detail, other things were happening in Blackwater Ridge that she would only piece together fully later. Margaret Howell, at the dry goods store, had noticed Caleb in town on the second day and had mentioned to her husband Frank that the Harper girl seemed to have picked up some hired help from somewhere. Frank Howell had mentioned it to the man who cut his hair, who mentioned it to his wife, who was the cousin of a woman who worked in the house of one of Edward Blackwell's foremen. It was the kind of chain that didn't require any individual in it to intend harm. It just happened, the way water finds the lowest path without being directed. By the time the information reached Blackwell's foreman, it had been through enough mouths that it had accumulated details that weren't accurate and lost details that were, and what Blackwell heard was that Violet Harper had found herself a man, which he interpreted in the way men of his particular type to interpret such things, as a weakness she was trying to disguise as a strength. He sent a man to find out more. The man he sent was named Curtis, and Curtis was good at presenting himself as something harmless, a traveling worker, a man passing through. He arrived at the Harper Ranch on a Thursday morning, asking if there was work available, and Violet assessed him in the first 30 seconds and found him wanting, but couldn't have said precisely why. She told him they weren't hiring. Curtis said that was all right, and that he heard the Harper outfit was doing good work, and asked conversational questions about the operation the way people do when they're actually doing reconnaissance and want to look like they're being friendly. Violet answered what she chose to answer and volunteered nothing. When Curtis left, she found Caleb at the water trough. There was always something wrong with the water trough, and told him what had happened. Caleb's face was still for a moment. "Curtis," he said. Heavy through the shoulders. Brown hat with a pinched front. "Yes, he works for Blackwell's foreman. His name is Tom Greer." Curtis has been Tom Greer's right hand for 3 years. He paused. "He wasn't looking for work. I know that. He was counting heads. Looking for what we have and what we don't." Caleb straightened. "Blackwell now knows roughly what your operation looks like. Which means he knows we're not as far down as he thought." She looked at him. "Which means he's going to push again. Soon," Caleb said. Soon turned out to be the next morning. Gerald Fitch arrived at the ranch himself, which was unusual enough to be alarming. Gerald Fitch did not make ranch calls. Gerald Fitch sat in his bank and let people come to him, because the architecture of power in a frontier town ran through who moved toward whom. He came in a good buggy with his coat buttoned, and he smiled the smile of a man who has been coached on how to deliver difficult news in a way that sounds reasonable. Roy met him at the gate and came immediately to find Violet, who was in the middle of a task she could not immediately put down. By the time she came to the yard, Gerald Fitch had been standing there for 4 minutes, which had given him time to look at the operation and calculate something, and she didn't like what she saw in his eyes when he turned to face her. "Miss Harper," he said, "I apologize for calling unannounced." "No, you don't," she said. "What is it, Gerald?" He blinked. He preferred being called Mr. Fitch, but she had made a decision about that years ago. "I've come about the loan terms, the adjusted terms you sent by letter 10 days ago." There's been a further development. He produced an envelope from his coat. "The Banks Board has conducted a review of all outstanding loans in the region, and I'm afraid the Harper loan has been flagged for what we're calling a risks reassessment." She took the envelope but didn't open it. "Plain language, Gerald." He shifted. "The bank is requesting full collateral verification and a payment of 30% of the outstanding balance within 21 days, with the remainder to be renegotiated under new terms." The number hit her like cold water. 30% in 21 days was not a payment plan. It was a demolition. She did the calculation instantly, and it didn't change, no matter how she ran it. That number, in that time frame, was not possible. Not without selling so much stock that she'd have no operation left to save. She kept her face composed. "I see," she said. "I want you to know that this isn't personal." Had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "The bank has obligations to its depositors, and to its board, and in the current environment." "Who sits on the bank's board, Gerald?" He stopped. "Besides yourself," she said. "Who else?" He named 3 names. The third one was Blackwell's attorney. She nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming out personally," she said. "It shows good faith." He left 5 minutes later, having achieved nothing except confirming what she had already known, that the pressure was organized, intentional, and coming from a direction that had its legal protection carefully arranged. She stood in the yard after his buggy disappeared down the road and let herself have 10 full seconds of something very close to despair. Not panic, not collapse, but the real, honest weight of a situation that was worse than she had allowed herself to admit. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He waited. 21 days, she said. "I heard. 30% of the outstanding balance in 21 days. I know." She looked at the ranch around her, the barn her father built, the house where she had grown up, the pasture where the cattle were moving in the morning light. "He's not squeezing anymore," she said. "He's closing his fist." "Yes," she turned to look at Caleb. "Tell me honestly. Do you think it's possible?" He met her gaze directly, and she appreciated that he didn't rush to reassure her. He thought about it for a real moment, actually calculated, actually considered. "Not through normal channels," he said. "Not in 21 days at that number." "Then what channel?" "The buyers I mentioned. One of them, a man named Harlan Bates, out of Helena, has the capital to move quickly and pays honest prices. He's been looking to expand his herd, and he's no friend of Blackwell's. They had a falling out over a land deal 2 years ago." He paused. "If I reach him today, we might have an answer within the week." "And if Bates says no, then we think of something else." He looked at her steadily. "We haven't run out of moves, Violet." It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it without reacting to it. "Get a message to Bates today," she said. "I'll ride this morning, and Caleb." He turned back. She held his eyes. "I need to know if there are limits to this. If there's a point where the cost to you becomes more than makes sense." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking you to go down with a sinking ship. I'm asking you to help me keep it from sinking. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll tell you if I see a limit," he said. "I haven't seen one yet." "Then ride." He rode, and Violet Harper went back into the house and sat down at her kitchen table, and did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in 3 years. She put her head in her hands. Just for a moment, just for 60 counted seconds, she gave herself exactly that, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Then she picked her head up, opened the ledger, and went back to work. She was still at the table at noon, when Danny knocked on the kitchen doorframe. He never came all the way in without being invited, which she found touching in its formality. "Miss Harper, there's 2 women here from town." She looked up. "Who?" "Mrs. Howell and Mrs. Aldrich. Margaret Howell and her closest friend Diane Aldrich." Violet kept her face neutral. "Send them in." Margaret Howell entered the kitchen with the particular manner she carried everywhere, slightly elevated, slightly pained, as though the world perpetually fell short of the standards she had set for it. Diane Aldrich followed her in, smaller and quieter, the minor key to Margaret's major. "Violet," Margaret said, with the tone of a woman who has come to deliver a kindness that will not be experienced as one. "Margaret." Diane. Violet closed the ledger. "Sit down." They sat. Margaret looked at the ledger, at the open correspondence on the table, at the general evidence of an operation being managed under pressure, and her expression arranged itself into something that was the architecture of sympathy around a core of satisfaction. "We heard about the bank's visit this morning," Margaret said. Of course she had. Fitch's buggy in the yard for 20 minutes would have been noted and discussed, and been halfway around town before noon. "It was a routine meeting," Violet said. "Of course." Margaret folded her hands. "We wanted to come. And Violet, I'm going to say something that I hope you'll receive in the spirit it's intended. We're concerned about you. A number of people in town are concerned." "That's very kind. We think, and I'm speaking now as someone who knew your father and who cares about his legacy, that perhaps the time has come to consider whether continuing to fight for the ranch is the wisest course." Violet looked at her steadily. "You think I should sell?" "I think you should consider your options," Margaret said carefully. "You're a young woman. You have your whole life ahead of you. There are men, good men, respectable men who would be honored to." "To what?" Violet said. Margaret paused. "To provide you with a more suitable situation." "A more suitable situation." Violet let the words sit in the air between them for a moment. "Margaret, I want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. You're saying that the appropriate response to a coordinated effort to take my land from me is for me to marry one of the men who think I can't handle it." "That's not what I said, it's what you meant." Margaret's composure tightened slightly. "I meant that there's no shame in recognizing when a situation is beyond a woman's capacity to handle it," Violet said. That's the end of that sentence. Silence fell over the kitchen. Diane Aldrich had been looking at the table. She looked up now, and something in her face was different from what Violet expected. "She's right, Margaret," Diane said quietly. "That is what you meant." Margaret turned to look at her friend. "I've been thinking about it since we left the house this morning," Diane continued. She looked at Violet. "My husband's first ranch failed. Do you remember that? Before we moved here. It failed because of debt and a bad year and a neighbor who made things harder than they had to be. And nobody came to counsel him to find a nice woman to marry so he could have a more suitable situation." She paused. "They helped him find a way through. The kitchen was very quiet." Violet looked at Diane Aldrich with genuine surprise. "Thank you, Diane," she said, and meant it entirely. Margaret stood. Her chin was elevated, and her hands were clasped, and she was recalibrating her understanding of the morning in real time. "I can see that my concern is not welcome." "Your concern is received," Violet said. "Your conclusion about what to do with it is the part I'm declining." Margaret left. Diane lingered for a moment longer. "I don't know that you can win this," Diane said, honestly, without cushioning. "But I know you shouldn't have to fight it alone." "I'm not alone," Violet said. Diane nodded slowly. "That cowboy," she said. "He's good." Diane seemed to weigh that. Then she nodded again and left. Violet sat for a moment in the kitchen after both of them were gone. Then she picked up her ledger and went back to the numbers and held herself in the task, with the discipline she had been practicing for 3 years. An hour later, Roy put his head in the doorway. "Letter just came," he said. "By fast post." He laid it on the table. She looked at the return address. Helena, Montana. Harlan Bates. Her heart moved in her chest. She opened it. He had written back the same day. Caleb had reached him, which meant Caleb's message had arrived, which meant Caleb had ridden harder than she had known, and found a way to get the message through inside a day. The letter was brief and direct, in the handwriting of a man who said what he meant and stopped. He was interested. He was coming. He would arrive in Blackwater Ridge within the week to look at the stock. She read the letter twice. Then she put it in the box with the other important documents. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch her father had built, at the land that people had been telling her she couldn't hold for 3 years. She was still holding it. Caleb arrived back at the ranch an hour before supper, dusty and tired in the way that a man gets after a hard ride. He came in from the barn and found her at the water pump in the yard and stopped when he saw her face. "He wrote," he said. It wasn't a question, he wrote. She looked at him. "He's coming within the week." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, not surprise, because she had the sense he had believed this would work and had ridden accordingly. It was something quieter than relief. More like the steady settling of a thing that had been precarious and had found its footing. "That's good," he said simply. "You rode hard." The message needed to be there before he left for the northern ranges. She looked at him. He was tired, genuinely tired, not performing it, and he was standing in her yard, at the end of a hard day that he had put in for her operation, for her problem, for land that wasn't his, and a fight that no one had asked him to take on. "Come inside," she said. "There's food." He followed her in. And at the table, over a meal that Danny had cobbled together with more enthusiasm than skill, she looked at Caleb Westwood across the plates and the ledger and thought something she hadn't let herself think about a person in a long time. She thought, "I am glad he is here." She didn't say it. She wasn't built for saying that kind of thing easily, and she wasn't sure she trusted it yet, and there was still far too much left to fight. But she thought it. And across the table, Caleb cut a piece of bread and passed it to her without being asked, because he had noticed 3 days ago that she always forgot to eat the bread, and he had decided, quietly and without announcement, to do something about it. Roy saw it. Roy saw everything. He sat at the end of the table and ate his food and said nothing at all, but the lines around his eyes deepened in a way that, if you knew him, meant he was working very hard not to smile. Outside, the night was coming in fast over the Montana plain, and somewhere in town, Edward Blackwell was likely sitting in his comfortable house, counting the days he thought Violet Harper had left. He was wrong about the count. He was wrong about a great many things. But he hadn't figured that out yet. And until he did, every day was going to be a fight, and every fight was going to matter, and the woman at the kitchen table with the ledger and the bread she kept forgetting to eat was going to be ready for every single one of them. Harlan Bates arrived on a Tuesday, 4 days after his letter, which was faster than Violet had expected and faster, she suspected, than Edward Blackwell could have anticipated. He came in a hired wagon with 2 men she didn't know and a manner that was the opposite of Gerald Fitch's careful performance of authority. Bates was broad and blunt and moved through the world like a man who had decided long ago. That pretense was a waste of time that he didn't have. He shook her hand the way he would have shaken a man's hand, which she noted without comment, and he looked at the cattle with the eyes of someone who actually knew what he was looking at, which she noted with considerably more appreciation. "Westwood said your breeding stock was quality," he said, walking the fence line of the main pasture with his hands in his pockets. "Westwood doesn't oversell. You've worked with him before?" "Crossed paths in Colorado. He helped me settle a dispute with a supplier that was going sideways. Didn't ask for anything in return." Bates paused at the fence and studied the cattle with genuine attention. He said you were in a fight worth being in. She looked at him. He said that? His words were something like, she's the kind of woman who holds what she builds, and she's fighting someone who wins by making the ground soft under people's feet. Bates turned to her. I've had my own history with that kind of opponent. It makes me inclined to pay a fair price. She absorbed that for a moment. Then she walked him through the stock she was prepared to sell, and she showed him the breeding records her father had kept, and she had continued in the same ledger with the same careful hand. And Bates read the records with the thoroughness of a man who understood what they represented. They sat in the kitchen afterward and negotiated. Caleb was not in the room. She had not asked him to be there, and he had not offered himself, which she found she was beginning to read as one of his most consistent qualities. He understood the difference between support and intrusion, and he navigated it without being told. Roy was at the table, because Roy had been her father's man and was now hers, and his presence in any formal ranch business was both practical and symbolic in a way she had never felt the need to explain. The negotiation was direct and went faster than she'd expected. Bates named a number that was honest rather than generous, and she came back with a figure that was defensible rather than hopeful. And they found a price between the two that left her with the animals she couldn't afford to lose and gave him a strong addition to his Helena operation. He paid a cash deposit on the spot, with the remainder to follow when the stock was transferred the following week. She walked him to his wagon afterward, and they shook hands again. One thing, Bates said before he climbed up, Blackwell is going to find out I was here inside 24 hours. He has ears in this town, I know. When he does, he's going to move. He doesn't like competition from independent buyers, and he doesn't like anyone who refuses to work inside his arrangements. Bates looked at her steadily. You should be ready for the next push to come quickly, and from a direction you're not expecting. She met his eyes. Thank you for the warning. Thank Westwood, he said. It was his read of the situation. He drove away, and she stood in the yard for a moment, with the deposit in her hand, actual money, in the right amount, going toward the right problem, and let herself feel the specific relief of a battle that has been partially, genuinely won. Then she went inside to get ready for the next one. Caleb was in the barn when she found him. She held up the deposit without saying anything, and he looked at it, and then looked at her, and the expression that moved across his face was something she would think about later. In the quiet parts of the night when she had space to think about things she didn't examine during the day. It was pride, she decided eventually, not pride in himself. Pride in her, the kind of pride that belongs to someone who was on your side before you won anything. One problem down, he said. Several left, she answered. That's how it usually goes. He turned back to the saddle he'd been working on. How much runway does this give you? If I manage it carefully, I can meet the adjusted deadline and have enough left to carry operations through fall. She paused. But Bates warned me. Blackwell will find out about this quickly. He's going to push again. Bates is right, he will. Caleb set down the saddle tool. We need to stop reacting and start moving first. She looked at him. What does that mean, practically? It means finding out what Blackwell's next move is before he makes it. If he's planning another play through the bank, we need to know which lever he's going to pull. If it's through the community suppliers, buyers, social pressure, we need to know that too. He met her eyes. Do you have anyone in town who's into position to hear things? She thought. Diane Aldrich, the woman who came to the house. She moves in the same circles as Margaret Howell, who moves in the same circles as everyone in Blackwater Ridge, who considers themselves important. And unlike Margaret, Diane seems to have arrived at the conclusion that I deserve a fair chance. She paused. I don't want to put her in a difficult position. You don't have to ask her to do anything she's uncomfortable with, Caleb said. Just let her know you'd welcome information if it came her way. She'll decide the rest herself. Violet considered that. It was a careful line and she understood it. I'll talk to her. She talked to Diane Aldrich the next morning, going to town for supplies and stopping at the seamstress shop on the way back. She laid out the situation plainly, because Diane had struck her as a woman who responded to honesty better than to diplomacy, and she said exactly what Caleb had suggested, not a request. just an open door. Diane listened without interrupting. Then she said, "My husband plays cards with one of the men on the bank's board on Friday evenings. The one who isn't Blackwell's attorney." Violet nodded carefully. "He's mentioned that there's been disagreement on the board about the Harper loan. Not everyone is comfortable with the way the timeline has been adjusted." Diane looked at her directly. "You might have more support there than you think, if someone made the case properly." That was more than Violet had expected. She filed it away with the precision of someone who was building a picture one piece at a time, and she thanked Diane, and she drove back to the ranch with her mind already moving through the implications. "So," she told Caleb. He was quiet for a moment. A dissenting voice on the board, he said. "That's significant. It is if I can speak to him directly." "Can you? I don't know yet." She thought about it. The board member Diane mentioned his name is Everett Crane. "He owns the mill on the south end of town. He was a friend of my father's." Caleb looked at her. "Your father had friends on the bank's board?" "My father had friends everywhere," she said, with a quality in her voice that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite pride, but lived somewhere between the two. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and remembered what mattered to them. He kept notes. She paused. "I still have the notes." There was a silence. "Violet," Caleb said, "if Everett Crane has any loyalty to Thomas Harper's memory." "I know," she said. "I'm going to see him tomorrow." "Alone?" She met his eyes. "This part needs to be mine." He didn't argue. He just nodded, and she understood that he had heard the full sentence, not just the practical statement about the meeting, but the deeper one underneath it, about what she needed this particular fight to be. She went alone the next morning, and she sat across from Everett Crane in his mill office, with her hands folded and her spine straight, and she told him the truth about everything. Not just the financial situation, which he knew in broad outline from the board discussions, but the systematic nature of it, the hands who'd been pushed out, the supplier problems. The way the bank's adjustments coincided precisely with Blackwell's interests and ambitions. Everett Crane was 60 years old and had the face of a man who had seen a lot of things he wished he could have changed. He listened to all of it without speaking, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "told me once that the worst thing a community could do was decide in advance who deserved to succeed." He looked at his desk. "I've been uncomfortable with the board discussions for weeks. I didn't know what to do with that discomfort." "You could vote against the next motion," she said plainly. He looked at her. "One vote doesn't change an outcome." "One vote changes the record," she said, "and it changes whether the man next to you feels alone in his doubt." She paused. "Are there others who are uncomfortable?" Everett Crane looked at her for a long time. "There might be two others," he said carefully, "not three. Two. Are two enough to slow the next motion, not to defeat it, but to delay it perhaps? To require more documentation, more process." He turned a pen on his desk. "It would buy time. Time is what I need." He stood and extended his hand. "I'll do what I can," he said. "I'm not promising an outcome. I'm promising to stop being silent when I should be speaking." She shook his hand. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." She drove home feeling something that was dangerously close to hope, which she handled carefully, the way you handle something that can warm you, or burn you depending on how much of it you allow. The hope did not survive the week unchallenged. It was Roy who came to her on Thursday evening, and she knew, from how he looked, the way he was holding his hat, both hands, twisting it slowly, that whatever he had to tell her was going to hurt. "Say it, Roy." "I was in town this afternoon for the hardware order." He didn't look at her directly. "I heard something in the store. Didn't hear it from anyone with a reason to lie to me." "What did you hear?" "People are saying that Caleb Westwood is here for the land." He looked at her now, steadily. "The story that's going around is that he came here knowing you were in trouble, and that his plan is to run the ranch through the payment crisis, earn your trust, and position himself to take over the property if things get worse." She stood very still. "There's more," Roy said. "They're saying he has a history of doing this. Working struggling operations, getting close to the owners, and..." Then he stopped. "Where is this coming from?" Her voice was even. "I don't know the source. But it's moving fast. By tomorrow it'll be in every conversation in town. Roy looked at her with the eyes of a man who cared about her deeply and was doing her the respect of not softening what needed to be said. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying you need to think about it. She did think about it. She thought about it, standing in the kitchen after Roy went back to the bunkhouse, and she thought about it at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee that went cold without being drunk. And she thought about it the way she thought about all serious things systematically, without panic, following the logic wherever it led. The logic was uncomfortable. She had known Caleb Westwood for less than 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he had proven himself capable, thoughtful, and helpful in ways that had materially improved her situation. He had ridden to Helena and reached Harlan Bates and gotten a letter back in 24 hours. He had known about Curtis before she'd figured out who Curtis was. He had known about Blackwell's history, had known about the kind of pressure being applied, had arrived at precisely the moment the pressure was becoming acute. When she laid it out that way, it looked like either someone who genuinely understood the situations, or someone who had created it. She sat with that possibility for a long time. It was one of the hardest things she had done in 3 years, not the financial crisis, not the loneliness, not the constant weight of everyone's expectation that she would fail. Sitting in her kitchen, seriously entertaining the possibility that the one person who had shown up and helped was doing it for reasons that would eventually hollow her out from the inside. She went to the barn. Caleb was there, as he often was in the evenings, checking on Augustus, who was improving slowly and consistently. I need to ask you something, she said. He straightened and looked at her. He must have seen something in her face, because he went still in the particular way he went still when he understood something serious was happening. Ask. There's a story going around town that you came here with a plan to gain my trust during the crisis and position yourself to take over the property. The barn went very quiet. She watched his face. She had learned to watch faces carefully over years of being underestimated and occasionally lied to, and what she saw on Caleb Westwood's face in that moment was not guilt. It was not the careful rearranging of an expression caught out. It was something that was far more painful to witness. Actually, it was the particular hurt of a person who's been honest and finds that honesty is still insufficient protection against doubt. He was quiet for a moment. Who told Roy that? That's what you want to know first? Yes. His voice was level but not soft, because that story came from somewhere specific and the place it came from matters. She looked at him. Why? Because that story is designed to do exactly one thing: make you distrust the one resource that Blackwell hasn't been able to undercut. He met her eyes. Everything else he's tried has been about the operation. The hands, the bank, the suppliers. This is about you. Personally, it's a different kind of attack, and it means something. She held his gaze. It means he's worried. It means he's scared, Caleb said. There's a difference. Worried people get careful. Scared people get vicious. She stood with that for a moment. You didn't answer the accusation. No. He looked at her directly. Because you know it isn't true. And if you're standing here asking me, rather than deciding it without asking, then you know it isn't true. That landed. She felt it land. I have been wrong about people before, she said. I know. His voice was quieter now, I know that. And I know you'd be a fool not to consider it, and you're not a fool. He paused. I can't prove a negative to you, Violet. I can only tell you what's true. I came here because I heard about a fight worth being part of. I've stayed because he stopped. She waited. Because I haven't wanted to be anywhere else, he said. That's the truth. If you decide it isn't enough, I'll go. But I won't lie to make you more comfortable. She looked at him for a long moment. The barn was quiet around them. Augustus shifted in his pen. Where did you sleep the night you rode to Helena? She asked. He blinked, slightly surprised by the turn. On the road. I camped about 8 miles out on the way back. You didn't make it there and back in a day. No, I didn't tell you it was going to be a day. I told you I'd get the message there. You were gone 32 hours. Yes, you didn't expense the road time. You didn't mention it, no. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, the story is coming from Blackwell. It has his fingerprints on it, the same indirection, the same use of the community's mouth as the weapon. It's going to spread. People are going to say it to my faces, and not just behind my back. I know, when they do, I need to know that I've made this decision with my eyes open. She held his gaze. So I'm telling you directly, I don't believe it, but I need you to understand that I've thought about it seriously. And I need you to understand that if anything happens that changes my assessment, I will not wait to say so. I wouldn't want you to. Good. She turned toward the barn door. Augustus needs his evening salve. I was about to do it. I know. She paused at the door. The man who told Roy the story. I want to know who started it. Can you find that out, without making it visible? Probably, he said. Give me a day. She went back to the house. Caleb found her the next evening with a name which she had half expected, and that name was Curtis Blackwell's man who had come to the ranch pretending to look for work. The story had originated with Curtis in the saloon 3 days ago, which meant Blackwell had planted it, the moment he learned that the bait sale had gone through. He's burning his ammunition fast, Caleb said. He's not used to the fight going this long, she agreed. They were at the kitchen table. The lamp was lit, because the evening had come in early with cloud cover, and the light made the kitchen feel smaller and closer than it did in daylight. Roy was in the bunkhouse, Danny was asleep. It was just the two of them, and the table, and the ledger, and the low sound of the wind finding the gaps in the window frame. There's going to be a meeting, Caleb said. He had something in his voice that told her this was the thing he had been building toward. Blackwell is hosting a gathering at his property next week. He's calling it a community discussion about the future of ranching in the county. It's an invitation to every rancher and businessman in the region. She looked at him. How do you know this? Bates told me this afternoon. He received an invitation and he sent word. Bates was invited? Blackwell doesn't know. Bates came here as a favor. He thinks it was a routine transaction. Caleb looked at her steadily. Violet, that meeting isn't about the community, it's about you. He's going to use it to build a coalition ranchers who've had dealings with him, businessmen who depend on his goodwill, and he's going to frame your operation as a liability to the region's stability. She felt something cold move through her. He's going to make it political. He's going to make it social, which is worse. He's going to stand in his parlor and talk about responsible land stewardship and proper operation of frontier enterprises. And every person in that room is going to understand that what he's really saying is that a woman running a ranch alone is a problem that needs to be resolved. She was quiet. Are you invited? She asked. No. Caleb paused. No, she absorbed that. The deliberate exclusion of the person being discussed was its own statement, its own cruelty. And she recognized it with the weariness of someone who had spent years being the subject of conversations she wasn't permitted to participate in. Then I'll show up anyway, she said. He looked at her. Not to the meeting, she said. I'm not going to walk into Blackwell's parlor uninvited and give him the satisfaction of removing me publicly. She thought for a moment. But if he's gathering every rancher and businessman in the county next week, then the day before that meeting, I want to have spoken personally to every person who matters in that room. I want them to have heard my side before they hear his. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's 30, maybe 40 people in a week. I know, some of them are in Blackwell's pocket. Some of them, not all of them. She picked up the pen. Make me a list of every person you think will be in that room. Roy can add to it. I'll sort them by likelihood and we'll start tomorrow. He picked up a piece of paper. They worked late that night, long after the lamp oil was running low. She sorted names into columns, those she could probably reach, those who were committed to Blackwell's interests, those who might be reachable if she approached them the right way. She was not naive about the numbers. The column of people she could probably move was shorter than the column she couldn't. But it was longer than she had feared. There's something you should know before tomorrow, Caleb said when they were nearly done. She looked up. When you go to these meetings, people are going to ask about me. The story Curtis put out is still moving. Some of these men are going to wonder whether the reason you've made progress is because a man stepped in and effectively took over. I know, she said. How do you want to handle that? She thought about it seriously. The truth, she said. You're a hand I hired. You have experience I don't have in certain areas. I use that experience the same way my father used Roy's as a resource, not a replacement. She looked at him. Is that accurate? Yes, he said. Then that's what I'll say. She closed the ledger. The people who can't hear that aren't going to help me anyway. He nodded. He started to say something else, and then he stopped. What? She asked. He was looking at the table. I want to say something, and I'm not sure if it's the right moment. She waited. When this is over, he said, and the way he said it, not if but when, was something she registered in her chest. When the fight is settled one way or the other, I'd like to keep working this ranch. He looked up and met her eyes. Not as a hand, as a partner. Whatever that looks like in practical terms, we'd have to work it out. He paused. I'm saying it now, because I think you should know where I stand before you go into the next week. Not to complicate things, just so you know. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze steadily, with no performance in it, no strategically deployed vulnerability. Just a man telling a woman the truth and waiting to see what she did with it. She had not let herself feel this. She had been very disciplined about not feeling it. She had had too much to fight and too much to lose, and she had understood, with the part of her that was always calculating, that the worst possible time to let someone matter to you was in the middle of a battle where you needed to think clearly. She still knew that. She also knew that the man sitting across her kitchen table had ridden to Helena in 32 hours and camped on the road and never mentioned it. Had fixed the corner brace properly when it would have been faster to do it wrong. Had told her the truth about why he was here and kept telling her the truth when lies would have been more comfortable. Had sat in this kitchen night after night, looking at numbers that weren't his problem and working on solutions that weren't his responsibility. Ask me again, she said quietly, when it's over. He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted, not disappointment, not quite hope. Something steadier than both. Fair enough, he said. She stood. Tomorrow we start the calls. Early. I'll have the horses ready at first light. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind. And she thought about what it meant to be a woman who had spent 3 years building walls, and what it meant to have someone sit patiently on the other side of them without demanding to be let in. She thought about the word partner, the weight of it, the shape it made. She thought about tomorrow, and the people she needed to reach, and the fight she had not finished fighting yet. And somewhere in Blackwell's comfortable house across town, a man who had spent months squeezing slowly was getting ready to close his hand all the way. He thought the next week would finish her. He had been wrong about her before. He was about to find out exactly wrong a man could be. The week before Blackwell's meeting was the hardest week of work Violet Harper had ever done, and she had spent 3 years doing work that would have broken most people. She and Caleb rode out every morning before the sun was fully up, splitting the list. Between them, she taking the ranchers who had known her father, Caleb taking the independent businessmen, who had no particular loyalty to either side and could therefore be reached through plain argument rather than personal history. Roy stayed on the ranch with Danny and kept the operation running, which required its own kind of effort given that they were still 2 hands short of what the property needed. The calls were not easy. Some went well, some went badly. Most went somewhere in between, in the complicated human territory where a person genuinely wants to do the right thing, but isn't entirely sure what the right thing is, and has other considerations pressing on them from other directions. The first man on her list was a rancher named Gerald Pruitt, who had run cattle 3 miles north of the Harper property for 15 years, and who had attended her father's funeral and stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands. She found him at his barn, and she did not apologize for arriving without notice, because she had decided that arriving without notice was the only way to have a real conversation rather than a prepared one. Miss Harper, he said, with the particular wariness of a man who knows a serious conversation is coming and hasn't decided yet which way he's going to land on it. Gerald, she stood at the fence. You've been invited to Blackwell's gathering next week. He didn't confirm or deny it. That was its own confirmation. I'm asking you not to attend, she said. He looked at her steadily. That's a big ask, I know it is. She didn't soften it. I'm asking because the meeting isn't about what Blackwell says it's about. It's about building enough community weight to justify finishing what he's been doing to the Harper Ranch for that past year. And I think you know that. Pruitt was quiet. He looked at his boots. He looked at the fence. He was a man who measured words the way he measured feed carefully, because waste was something he had trained himself against. Your father, he said finally, helped me through a bad winter 8 years ago. Didn't make a thing of it. Just showed up with men and equipment when my north fence came down in the ice and I didn't have the hands to fix it myself. He paused. I've thought about that more than once in the past year. Then think about it once more, Violet said. He looked at her. What do you need from me? Beyond not attending. If there are men at that gathering who you think might hear reason, I'd be grateful for an introduction. Nothing more than that, he nodded slowly. There's a man named Samuels. Runs sheep out past the eastern ridge. He's had his own run-ins with Blackwell over water rights. I'll speak to him before the meeting. Thank you, Gerald. Don't thank me yet. He looked at her steadily. Blackwell has more reach than you know, Miss Harper. Be careful. She was already on her horse before he finished the sentence. The next 3 days went that way, conversation by conversation, each one its own small battle with its terrain and its own outcome. Some men listened and committed to nothing. Some listened and committed to small things. One man told her directly that he'd sold his goodwill to Blackwell 2 years ago over a water rights dispute, and there wasn't anything to be done about it, and she thanked him for his honesty and rode to the next name on the list. What she found by the 4th day was something she hadn't expected. She wasn't alone, not entirely, not in the way she had believed herself to be. There were people in that valley who had watched the Harper Ranch fight for 3 years and had never said anything publicly, partly from conflict aversion and partly from the reasonable calculation that private sympathy costs nothing and public support costs a great deal. But when she arrived in person and asked directly, some of them, not all, not even most, but some were willing to do more than feel quietly sorry for her. Diane Aldrich had organized a small thing without announcing it. 3 women whose husbands would be at the Blackwell meeting had agreed, at Diane's suggestion, to raise the Harper situation at their supper tables the night before the gathering. Not as political argument. Just as a question, the kind of question a wife asks a husband over food. In the domestic space where a man's public posture sometimes loosens, is what's happening to the Harper girl actually fair? Violet didn't find out about this until Diane told her on the 4th day, almost as an aside. She stopped in the middle of the street and looked at Diane. You organized that yourself, she asked. I asked some friends, Diane said simply. Women talk to their husbands. It seemed like a reasonable place to start. Violet Harper, who had not cried in 3 years, felt something move dangerously close to the surface of her composure. She pressed it down. She pressed it down hard, with all the practice she had. Diane, she said. Diane said, not unkindly. Just go do what you're going to do, Violet went. On the 5th day, Gerald Fitch sent another letter. She opened it at the kitchen table with Caleb sitting across from her, not because she needed the company, but because she had stopped pretending that facing bad news alone was the same as strength. The letter was brief. In language that was designed to sound procedural and feel devastating, it informed her that the bank's board had voted to proceed with the full collateral review, which would include a formal property assessment by an appraiser of the board's choosing, to be completed within 14 days. Caleb read the letter when she set it down. His jaw tightened. An appraiser of their choosing, he said, which means an appraiser who will find what Blackwell needs him to find. She kept her voice flat. They'll undervalue the property and use the gap between assessed value and loan balance to justify calling the full amount immediately. Or demanding the ranch as collateral. Yes, she looked at the letter. It's the legal mechanism he's been building toward. The meeting next week, the appraiser they're meant to work together. The meeting builds the community consensus that the ranch is mismanaged. The appraiser provides the financial documentation. Then the bank has everything it needs to move, and no one in town to object. Caleb looked at her steadily. We need our own appraiser. We don't have the money to commission an independent appraisal. Bates does. She looked at him. Bates has a financial interest in your operation now. He's got stock coming from this property. If that deal falls through because the ranch is seized, he loses money. Caleb's voice was measured. If I reach him today and explain what's happening, he might be willing to commission an independent appraisal. Not as a favor, as a business decision. She thought about it for 3 seconds. Do it. I'll send a telegram from town this morning. He went. She stayed at the table and looked at the letter and let herself think about what happened if all of this failed, not because she was giving up, but because she was the kind of person who had to look at the worst outcome directly and know she could survive it before she could fight effectively against it. If the ranch was seized, she would lose everything her father had built. The land, the cattle, the house where she had grown up. She would be left with her knowledge and her capability and her name and nothing else. Blackwell would get what he had always wanted, and Gerald Fitch would write a very neat final summary of the Harper loan and file it away, and the town would shake its collective head and say it was a shame, but what could you expect? She sat with that for a full minute, felt the weight of it. Let it be real. Then she stood, put the letter in the box, and went to check on Augustus, who was walking almost normally now and was demanding more grain than his recovery technically required. And who she indulged in this because her father had believed that animals like people recovered better when they were treated as though they were worth the extra effort. Caleb was back by early afternoon with confirmation that Bates had received the telegram and was responding immediately. The response came by late afternoon. Bates was commissioning an appraisal through a firm in Helena that had no connection to Blackwell's interests, and he was paying for it himself. The appraiser would be in Blackwater Ridge within 10 days. She read the confirmation twice. He didn't hesitate, she said. No, Caleb said. He didn't. She thought about what it meant that a man she had met once, who had come to look at cattle and paid a fair price and driven away, had taken her side this completely and this quickly. She thought about what that said about how her situation looked from the outside to someone who didn't have a community investment in believing she should fail. We have 10 days, she said, and the meeting is in 6. She nodded. Then the meeting matters more than ever. If we can get into that room, if there's someone in that room who can speak before Blackwell finishes his framing. Everett Crane, Caleb said. She looked at him. Everett is on the bank's board. He can't be seen to be publicly opposing Blackwell in a social setting without... I'm not saying Everett speaks against Blackwell, Caleb said carefully. I'm saying Everett asks a question, a reasonable question about process, about the appraisal standards being used, about whether the board's timeline has been adequately documented. He met her eyes. A question in a room full of people plants a seed. It doesn't have to be a speech. She thought about it. That's a great deal to ask of Everett. It is. He paused. Do you want me to ask him, or do you want to go yourself? She thought for half a second. I'll go. Everett Crane, when she laid it out for him the next morning in his mill office, was quiet for a long time. He turned his pen on his desk. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. You're asking me to expose my position on the board, he said. I'm asking you to ask a question, she said. One question. About process. In a room where Blackwell will know exactly what I'm doing. Yes, he turned the pen again. You know what that cost me. I know. She didn't look away. I know what I'm asking. He was quiet again. She waited. She did not fill the silence, because she had learned that filling silence was what you did when you weren't sure you deserved the answer you were asking for, and she was sure. Your father, Everett said finally, would have done the same for me. Without being asked, he set the pen down. I'll ask the question. She left his office and sat on her horse for a moment in the street, before she allowed herself to breathe fully. Then she rode. The night before Blackwell's meeting, Caleb found her at the old fence line, along the northern pasture, the one they had repaired together in the first week, the corner brace that he had reset properly. She was standing there in the last of the light with her hand on the post, not doing anything, just standing. He came and stood beside her without asking if she wanted company. By now he understood that her silences were not requests to be left alone. They were just silences. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. I've done everything I can do before it. You have. She looked at the pasture. At the cattle moving slowly in the evening. At the land that had been her father's and was now hers, and that she had refused, against every expectation and every pressure, to surrender. I keep thinking about what he said to me once, she said. My father, he said, a person's real character shows in what they do when it costs them something. Not when it's easy, when it costs. Caleb was quiet. I used to think he meant that as instruction, she said. Like a lesson about how to behave. She paused. Now I think he was telling me something about what to look for in other people. How to know who's real. The light was fading. The air had the cool edge of a Montana evening coming in. Caleb, she said. Yes. She turned and looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she had been carefully, not because she didn't see him, but because seeing him fully required admitting something that she had been rationing for reasons that were starting to feel less like wisdom and more like habit. You're real, she said. He looked back at her with that steadiness that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him and had never stopped noticing. Yes, he said, I am. She turned back to the pasture. He stayed beside her. Neither of them said anything more, but something had shifted between them, not dramatically. Not with the ceremony that such moments sometimes demand in stories told afterward. Just a settling, a thing becoming true that had been becoming true for a while and had finally arrived at itself. The morning of Blackwell's meeting, Violet woke before dawn and found, when she came to the kitchen, that Caleb had already made coffee. She poured a cup and sat at the table and looked at the ledger and the box of letters and the 3 years of paper evidence of a fight that had been real and costly and unrelenting. Then she looked up when she heard a sound outside. Roy appeared in the doorway. Behind him were 2 men she didn't immediately recognize. Miss Harper, Roy said, with the expression of a man who has a surprise he can't decide is good or bad yet. These men arrived this morning. Say they were sent by Harlan Bates. The 2 men were ranch hands, experienced ones. She could see that at a glance. The kind of men who knew what they were doing and didn't need to be managed through it. One of them held out a folded note. She read it. Bates had sent 2 experienced hands to work the Harper ranch for the next 30 days at his expense, with an offer to extend if the situation warranted. His note was characteristically brief. You shouldn't have to fight shorthanded. Consider it an investment in the stock I already bought. She folded the note. She looked at the 2 men. Roy will show you what needs doing, she said. Welcome to the Harper ranch. Caleb, who had read the note over her shoulder, met her eyes when she turned. Something in his expression was doing the thing it did when he was working hard not to show how much something had affected him. Bates is a good man, she said. He is, Caleb agreed. We're not shorthanded anymore. No, he said, we're not. She put the note in the box with the other documents. Then she went to get ready for the day, because Blackwell's meeting was happening whether she was ready for it or not. She didn't attend the meeting. She had known for days that she wouldn't, and she had made her peace with it. What she attended instead was a conversation arranged quietly, through Diane Aldrich's network of supper-table diplomacy, and Gerald Pruitt's word to Samuels, and 3 other men who had agreed to come to the Harper Ranch the morning of the meeting, to hear directly from the woman they'd been hearing about indirectly for years. They sat on the porch and at the kitchen table and spilled into the yard, 7 men in various states of made-up mind, and Violet talked to them the way she talked to everyone when she was being fully herself, without performance, without softening, with all the plain force of someone who had a true thing to say and said it. She told them about the loan and the adjusted timeline. She told them about the hands who had been pushed out. She told them about the appraiser being commissioned by the Banks Board, and the independent appraiser being commissioned by Harlan Bates. She told them about Curtis and the story that had been planted in the saloon. She did not tell them how afraid she had been. That wasn't their information. But she told them everything that was their information. Everything about the mechanism, the pattern, the intent. When she was done, one of the men, Samuels, the sheep rancher from the Eastern Ridge, who had had his own dealings with Blackwell's water rights maneuvering, sat for a moment and then said, "What do you need from us?" And she told him, not dramatically, not with a speech. She told him practically, specifically, in the language of people who work land and understand that abstract support means nothing next to concrete action. Some of them could speak to the community afterward about what they'd seen and heard on the Harper Ranch, the actual operation, the actual numbers, the actual quality of management. Some of them could make it known that they had concerns about the bank's appraisal process. Some of them could simply decline to add their voices to whatever consensus Blackwell tried to build in his parlor. 2 of them went to Blackwell's meeting. 3 of them didn't. 2 others said they needed to think about it. That afternoon, Caleb came back from town with news that made her sit down. Everett Crane had asked his question. He had waited until Blackwell was mid-presentation, had let the man build his case about responsible land stewardship and the community's best interests, had sat quietly through the part where Blackwell's language made it entirely clear that what he was discussing, the Harper property, without ever naming it directly. And then Everett Crane had raised his hand, with the mild, reasonable manner of a man asking for clarification rather than starting a fight, and asked about the appraisal standards being used by the bank's chosen firm, and whether those standards had been independently reviewed, and whether the board had documentation of the process that would be available for community review. It was by any objective measure a small thing, a question. 3 sentences. But it had done something that small things sometimes do when they land in the right place at the right time. It had created a pause, a visible pause, in which several men in that room had looked at each other, and several more had looked at Blackwell. And Blackwell had looked at Everett Crane with an expression that was controlled enough to be polite, but not controlled enough to be warm. He couldn't answer it cleanly, Caleb said, not without either admitting the process was irregular or lying in front of 30 witnesses. What did he say? He said the board's process was sound and he'd be happy to discuss specifics in an appropriate setting. Caleb met her eyes, which everyone in the room understood was not an answer. She sat with that. Samuel spoke up after Caleb continued. Said he'd heard that an independent appraisal was being commissioned. Said he was interested in seeing both assessments before forming an opinion. How did Blackwell respond? He wrapped up the meeting early. Caleb paused. He was angry, controlled but angry. He's not used to a room not following where he leads it. She looked at her hands. We haven't won anything, she said. This doesn't resolve the bank situation or the appraisal timeline. No, Caleb agreed, but it changes the temperature. And in a small community, temperature is everything. He looked at her. He came into that meeting expecting to build a wall around this operation. Instead, he found a room with cracks in it. She nodded slowly. The calculation was still running in her mind, the independent appraisal, arriving in 10 days, the bank's process now publicly questioned. The community's understanding of the situation fractionally shifted by the morning's conversations, by Everett's question, by Samuel's voice. It was not enough, not yet, but it was more than she had had a week ago. And a week ago, she had had more than the week before that. She was winning slowly, the way that slow things win by not stopping. That evening, after supper, after Roy and Danny and the 2 new hands were settled, after the ranch was quiet, she found Caleb on the porch. He was looking at the stars, which were extraordinary over the Montana plain, the kind of sky that reminded you the world was larger than whatever trouble was currently filling it. She came and stood beside him. Caleb, she said, Violet. I've been thinking about what you said, at the kitchen table. About partnership. He turned to look at her. I told you to ask me again when it was over, she said. It's not over. I know that. She held his gaze. But I don't think I want to keep treating that conversation like it has to wait for something external to finish before it can be real. He was very still. I'm not good at this, she said. I want to say that plainly. I don't have much practice I don't have any practice, actually. With letting someone in, with deciding someone is worth the risk of letting in. She paused. I've decided. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The night was around them, large and still, and indifferent to their human smallness in the middle of it. When I rode to Helena, he said quietly, I kept thinking the whole way out, and the whole way back about what it would mean if this worked. Not just the sale, all of it. He turned to face her fully. I thought about what it would mean to be somewhere I didn't have to keep moving through. She looked at him. I've been moving for a long time, he said. Looking for I didn't know what. Something worth stopping for, he met her eyes. I know what it is now. She had not allowed herself to want things that could be taken from her. Not since her father died, and the world demonstrated with clarity how quickly the things you count on can disappear. She had built her self-reliance like a fortification, and she had lived inside it, and it had kept her safe and upright through 3 years of sustained assault. Standing on the porch with Caleb Westwood's eyes on her, she felt the fortifications still there, the capability, the knowledge, the refusal to be small. All of that was hers and would remain hers. But she understood for the first time, with her whole self rather than just the part of her that could think about things clearly, that a fortification was not a home. She reached out and put her hand in his. His hand closed around hers. Carefully, with the same deliberate care, he brought to everything the fence braces done right, the salve applied properly, the 32 hours on the road to Helena without complaint. They stood there in the dark for a long time, looking at the land she was going to keep. And inside the house, Roy Cassidy, who had come to the window for a glass of water, and then stood there longer than a glass of water required, turned away with the careful, quiet satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough to know what real things look like when they finally find each other. He went to bed. Outside, the stars continued their cold and enormous indifference. Below them, on a porch in Blackwater Ridge, Montana, 2 people held on to something that was going to be worth holding. And in the morning, there was still a fight to finish. The independent appraiser arrived on a Wednesday morning, 8 days after Bates had commissioned him, and his name was Arthur Hollis, a compact, precise man from Helena who carried a leather satchel and spoke in the careful, measured language of someone who had learned that his words carried legal weight and treated them accordingly. He had no connection to Blackwell's interests, no history in Blackwater Ridge, and no opinion about Violet Harper except what he could derive from documents and direct observation. He spent 2 full days on the property. Violet did not follow him around. She went about the business of running the ranch, the cattle, the fence checks, the morning meetings with Roy and the 2 hands Bates had sent, and she let Arthur Hollis do his work without interference. Because interfering would have suggested she had something to manage, and she didn't. The ranch was what it was. The numbers were what they were. She had kept meticulous records since the day she inherited the property, in the same ledger her father had used, in the same careful hand, and those records told a story that didn't require her to be present to narrate it. On the second evening, Hollis came to the kitchen. Sand sat across from her and asked questions for 2 hours. He asked about the payment history, about the operational changes since Thomas Harper's death, about the staffing reductions and the reasons for them. He asked about the feed supplier situation, about the cattle count relative to the property's carrying capacity, about the water rights and the fencing schedule and the breeding records. She answered everything, every single thing, without hedging and without performance. When he was done, he closed his notebook and looked at her. "Miss Harper," he said, "I've conducted a great many property assessments in this state. I want you to understand that what I'll submit is my honest professional finding, based entirely on what I've seen and documented here." "I wouldn't want anything else," she said. He nodded. "Then I'll tell you informally, before the written report is complete, that this property is in considerably better condition than the circumstances I was briefed on would suggest." He paused. "Someone has worked very hard to maintain this operation." She looked at him steadily. "Several people have." He left the next morning. She watched his wagon go down the road and turned to find Caleb standing a few feet away, watching her. "2 more days before the bank's appraiser is scheduled," he said. "I know. Hollis will have his report filed before then." "Yes." She turned back toward the barn. "Caleb, when Hollis's report goes to the bank's board, when Everett Crane has it in his hands alongside whatever the bank's appraiser produces, what happens if the 2 assessments are significantly different?" Caleb thought about it. The board has a problem. 2 conflicting professional assessments means they can't move on the Harper loan without documenting their reasoning in writing for choosing one assessment over the other. and that documentation becomes a public record. Which means Blackwell's attorney, who sits on that board, has to sign his name to the reasoning. Yes, she looked at him. He won't want to do that. No man with a legal career wants his name on a document that explains why he chose a lower valuation without adequate cause. He met her eyes. It's the kind of thing that follows a person. She nodded slowly. The picture was becoming clearer, not comfortable, not resolved, but clearer. The fight wasn't won. But the ground was firming up under her feet in a way it hadn't been in weeks. I need to go to town, she said. I need to see Everett Crane before the bank's appraiser arrives. I'll come with you. No, she looked at him. I need to do this part alone. Not because I don't want your help. Because the message lands differently when it comes from me, directly. No intermediary, no support. Just Violet Harper walking into the mill office and making her case. He understood. She could see it in his face, the slight tightening that meant something cost him, followed by the deliberate loosening that meant he had accepted it. Be careful, he said. Always she rode into town alone. Everett Crane received her without making her wait, which was its own statement. A man who makes you wait is a man reminding you where the power sits. He came out to meet her himself and ushered her into his office and closed the door. The appraisal, she said without preamble, I know. He was already nodding. Hollis's report came through this morning by telegram. Preliminary figures. He looked at her. It's significantly higher than what the bank's process will produce. How significantly? He named the number. She kept her face still. The gap between the two valuations was not a matter of professional interpretation. It was not the kind of difference that could be attributed to methodology or perspective. It was the kind of difference that meant one of two things. Either the bank's appraiser was incompetent, or the bank's appraiser had been given a number to find and had gone looking for it. Everett, she said carefully, when the board sees both assessments, what happens? He leaned back in his chair. He was the kind of man who thought with his whole body. She had noticed that about him, the way he used physical stillness to do his most serious thinking. Blackwell's attorney will argue for the lower figure, he said. He'll find process arguments. He'll suggest Hollis lacks sufficient regional experience. He'll find something. He paused. But two of the other board members, the ones I mentioned before, the ones who were uncomfortable, they've seen Hollis's preliminary figures. They reached out to me this morning. She looked at him. They want to slow the process, he said. They want a full board review before any action is taken on the Harper loan. That review would take at minimum 30 days. He met her eyes. 30 days changes the situations considerably. It gives the independent appraisal time to be fully documented, she said. It gives more than that. He folded his hands. It gives the community time to understand what's happening. After the meeting last week, after Samuels and the others started talking, people are asking questions they weren't asking before. If the board is seen to be moving hastily on a contested assessment, after those questions are already in the air. The optics are bad, she said. The optics are very bad, he agreed. And Blackwell knows it. He paused. I had a conversation with him yesterday. He asked me, in the careful way he asks things, whether I thought the Harper situation was going to become a problem for the bank's reputation. She went very still. What did you say? Everett Crane smiled for the first time since she'd sat down. It was a small smile, but it was real. I told him that it depended entirely on whether the bank's process could withstand public scrutiny. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't like that, she said. He did not. Everett picked up the pen he always had on his desk. He left the conversation earlier than he intended to, which told me something about his confidence in the answer. She rode back to the ranch with the window of 30 days in her head, turning it over, examining it from every angle. 30 days was not a resolution. It was a delay, but a delay that allowed Hollis's report to be fully documented, that allowed community opinion to continue shifting, that allowed Bates's commercial interest in the property's stability to be a matter of record. A delay was sometimes the thing that turned a fight. She told Caleb when she got back. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, with his full attention, not the performative attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. The board votes on whether to proceed or review within 2 days, she said. Everett thinks they have the votes to require the full review. And if they do, then we have 30 days to make this fight too public and too documented for Blackwell to finish it without exposing himself. She looked at him directly. Which means we use those 30 days. How? She thought about it. She had been thinking about it the entire ride back. Bates, she said, he has the independent appraisal. He has a commercial interest in this property. He has his own documented grievances with Blackwell from the Colorado deal. She paused. If Bates makes it known through his business network, through the Helena commercial community, that what's happening to the Harper Ranch is a pattern, not an isolated incident, it becomes something bigger than one small ranch in Montana, Caleb said. It becomes a story about how Edward Blackwell does business. She met his eyes. And men who do business with Blackwell start to wonder if the same thing could happen to them. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I can reach Bates today. Yes. But Caleb, she stopped. He looked at her. This is the part where it could go wrong very badly, she said. If Blackwell finds out we're working this from multiple directions simultaneously, he's not going to sit and wait. He's going to retaliate, and his retaliation will be fast, and it will be personal. I know. I want you to understand that. What I'm asking you to do, what we're doing together, it's not without risk to you specifically. He knows who you are now. He knows you're connected to this. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not fear, not calculation, but the steady, clear-eyed look of a man who has already made his decision and is simply being asked to confirm it. Violet, he said, I told you when I came here that I was part of this. I haven't changed my mind. He held her gaze. Send me to Bates. She sent him. The next 2 days were the longest she had lived since the week after her father's funeral. She worked the ranch. She talked to Roy. She sat with Danny in the evenings and listened to the boy talk about what he was learning, which was considerable, because Danny had the natural curiosity of someone who had never been told that knowing things was above his station. She checked on Augustus, who was fully recovered now, and back with the herd, and who she found herself looking at, with a feeling she couldn't entirely name something about the particular satisfaction of watching. Something that had been injured come all the way back. On the second evening, a rider came from town. He was one of the hands who sometimes worked errands, and he had a message from Everett Crane, handwritten on the mill's paper. The board had voted, 4-2, requiring a full review before any action on the Harper loan. She read the note twice, then she went to find Roy. He was in the barn. She handed him the note without saying anything. He read it, and the lines around his eyes deepened in the way that meant he was working very hard, not to show how much something had moved him. Thomas would have been something to see right now, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. He would have. She took the note back and put it in the box. Caleb returned from Helena the next morning with news that arrived like cold water in the best possible way. Bates had already been talking. The independent appraisal, combined with the documented pattern of Blackwell's business conduct, had reached 3 significant commercial players in Helena who had their own reasons to be skeptical of Blackwell's methods. One of them had sent a letter to the Montana Territorial Bank Commissioner's office, not a complaint technically, but an inquiry about the standard of documentation required when bank boards acted on contested property assessments. An inquiry from a Helena businessman to the bank commissioner's office was, in the intricate hierarchy of frontier financial politics, the equivalent of a thundercloud on the horizon. It didn't have to become a storm to change behavior. It just had to be visible. Blackwell is going to hear about that inquiry within the week, Caleb said. I know. Violet set down the cup she was holding. When he does, he's going to have to calculate the cost, Caleb said. The cost of pushing forward versus the cost of what happens if this becomes a formal investigation into his methods. A man like Blackwell doesn't get where he is without understanding cost, she said. He'll do the math, yes. She looked at him. And what does the math tell him? Caleb held her gaze, that the Harper Ranch is one property. That one property is not worth a formal inquiry, a contested bank review, a documented pattern of interference, and a Helena business community that has started paying attention to his methods. He paused. He built his position on quiet operations. Quiet doesn't work anymore. She was quiet for a moment. The full weight of what Caleb was saying, what it meant if he was right, was almost too large to hold in her chest all at once. "He might not fold," she said. "He's proud. Men like him don't fold cleanly." "No," Caleb agreed. "They find a face-saving exit. Something that lets them step back without looking like they were pushed." 3 days later, Gerald Fitch came to the ranch again. Unannounced, like the first time, except this time his expression was different. The first time he had come with the careful managed face of a man delivering an outcome he was comfortable with. This time he looked like a man who had been asked to carry a message he would have preferred to decline. He stood in the yard. Violet came to meet him, and this time she didn't invite him inside. "Miss Harper," he said. "Gerald." He opened his coat and produced an envelope. "The board has reviewed the loan situation in light of the independent appraisal that was recently filed." She waited. "After review," he said, with the careful pronunciation of a man reading from a mental script, "the board has determined that the Harper loan is in satisfactory standing, given the property values documented in the recent assessment, and that no further adjustment to the payment timeline is required at this time." She looked at him. "The previous adjustment," he continued, "has been reversed. The original payment schedule is reinstated." The yard was very quiet. Violet let the silence sit for a moment. She let it sit long enough that Fitch had to stand in it. "I appreciate the board's thoroughness," she said. Fitch nodded, with the expression of a man who has delivered an unpleasant message and wants very badly to be released from the conversation. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "No," he said. "That concludes it." He left. She watched his buggy until it turned onto the road and disappeared. Then she turned around, and Caleb was standing in the barn doorway, and Roy was coming from the north pasture, and Danny had appeared from somewhere with hay on his shirt, and the two hands Bates had sent were pausing their work to look at her. She looked at all of them. "Original payment schedule," she said. "Reinstated." Roy made a sound she had never heard from him before. It was brief and low, and it contained more than most long speeches. Danny said, "Does that mean we're keeping the ranch in the honest, direct way of someone too young to have learned that some questions you're supposed to already know the answer to before you ask?" "Yes," Violet said. "That means we're keeping the ranch." Danny grinned with his whole face, the uncomplicated, full-hearted grin of a 16-year-old who has no practice hiding what he feels, and Violet Harper, who had been holding herself together with wire and will for 3 years, felt something give way in her chest, not painfully, not in the way of breaking, but in the way of a door that has been held shut against pressure, finally being allowed to open. She didn't cry. She was who she was, but her eyes were bright when she turned to find Caleb standing directly in front of her, having crossed the yard in the time she'd spent looking at Danny's grin. And she looked up at him, and his expression was the one she had been learning to read over the past weeks, steady, real, with the particular quality of warmth that he only let fully visible when they were close enough that the rest of the world wasn't the immediate concern. "You held it," he said quietly. "We held it," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You held it. I helped carry some of the load." "That's different." She looked at him. "Is it?" "Yes," he said. "The ranch is yours. The fight was yours. I just stood where you needed someone to stand." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Is that going to keep being something you want to do?" He looked at her with the full, unguarded steadiness of a man who is not performing certainty, but simply has it. "For as long as you'll have me," he said. She held his gaze. Then she did something she had not done in 3 years of fighting and holding and refusing to give ground. She reached out, not for a fence post, not for a ledger, not for the next tool required by the next problem, but for the person standing in front of her, and she put her hand on his chest, over his heart, just for a moment. He put his hand over hers. Roy turned away very deliberately and said something to Danny about the north pasture that Danny clearly didn't need to be told. And the two Bates hands found their way back to their work with the practiced efficiency of people who understand when they are not the point. Later, not much later, because there was still a ranch to run and the world to lie, 9 knee mycones, Evelyn, when they were significant, Violet sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Harlan Bates, thanking him with the specificity and directness that characterized everything she put on paper. She listed what his support had made possible, named the outcome plainly, and told him that his stock transfer was fully on schedule and that the Harper breeding herd would continue to produce the quality he had assessed. The second was to Everett Crane, shorter, because some things are better honored with brevity. She wrote only that she understood what his question in that room had cost him, and that she would not forget it. The third letter was harder to write and took longer. It was to the 3 women she knew personally who were running small operations in the county under circumstances that weren't entirely unlike what she had just come through: widows, inheritors, women who had stumbled into ownership through loss and were navigating it alone. She didn't offer advice. She didn't presume to know their situations. She simply wrote to tell them that they were not the only one, and that she was here, and that if there was anything she had learned, or any resource that might be useful, she was willing to share it. She sealed all 3 envelopes and set them aside for morning. Caleb was at the table with his own papers, the ranch operational notes he'd started keeping, in the same kind of careful, systematic way she kept the ledger, which she had noticed and not commented on, but which she had registered as the act of someone who was thinking about the long term. He looked up when she set down her pen. Letters? 3 of them. The women you mentioned, the ones running operations alone. She looked at him. How did you know? Because it's the next thing, he said simply. You've been thinking about it for a week. I could see it. She studied him for a moment. The fact of being known, really known, seen accurately without asking for it, was still new enough that it caught her off guard sometimes. She was still learning to receive it without deflecting. Yes, she said, it's the next thing. He nodded and went back to his notes. She went back to looking at the 3 sealed envelopes, and she thought about her father, who had helped Gerald Pruitt through a bad winter without making a thing of it, who had believed that the measure of a person was what they did caught when it cost them something, and who had taught her to keep records and read weather and know the difference between a horse that was spooked and a horse that was tired, and who had never once told her that any of it was beyond her. She thought about what it meant to carry something forward. Not just a ranch, a way of doing things, a way of being in the world that said a person doesn't have to become smaller to be accepted. The right people will accept the full size of you. 6 months after Gerald Fitch made his reluctant visit to the Harper Ranch, the property was running at a capacity it had not achieved since before Thomas Harper's death. The 2 hands Bates had sent had stayed on, one permanently and one on a seasonal arrangement that suited him better. Roy was still there, would be there, she suspected, until the land itself decided it didn't need him anymore. Danny had become, with startling speed and the particular hunger of someone who has found the work they were meant for, a genuinely skilled ranch hand who was beginning to have opinions about cattle breeding that were worth listening to. Edward Blackwell did not disappear. Men like Blackwell don't disappear. They consolidate their remaining position. They find other operations to pressure. They keep their eyes on the horizon for the next opportunity. She knew he was there. She stayed watchful, but his attention had moved, the way water moves when it finds a path obstructed, not defeated, but redirected. Gerald Fitch was cordial to her when she went to the bank, in the careful, slightly uncomfortable way of a man who has been on the wrong side of something, and doesn't know how to acknowledge it without fully acknowledging it. She accepted his cordiality with the efficiency of someone who has better uses for her time than nursing a grievance. The 3 letters she had written produced 6 responses. 4 of the women wrote back. 2 of those exchanges led to actual conversations, one at her kitchen table, one at the other woman's property outside of town. She did not have a plan for what she was building. She had only the instinct that it was the right direction to move in, and she had learned to trust that instinct the way she trusted weather reading and horse behavior imperfectly, but more often right than wrong. Caleb noticed what was happening without her having to explain it. He found her one evening rereading a letter from a woman in the next county who was struggling with a supplier problem that had the same fingerprints as what had been done to the Harper Ranch. And he said quietly, "You're going to need to document this. The pattern. If you're going to help people fight it, you need the record." She looked at him. I know, I can help with that, he said. If you want. I know that too, she folded the letter. You have a habit of knowing what the next thing is before I've said it. You have a habit of already being 3 steps into the next thing before most people have noticed the first one. He held her eyes. It works. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I talked to Roy this morning about the partnership arrangement. He went still. He had thoughts, she said. Of course he did. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that it was about time. She watched Caleb's expression. He also said that my father would have liked you. Which, from Roy, is the highest endorsement available. Something moved through Caleb's face. Something she recognized now as the expression he had when something affected him more than he'd expected it to. Roy is a good judge of character, he said, after a moment. He is. She looked at him steadily. We'll draw up the formal arrangement next week. Everett Crane knows a fair attorney. She paused, equal standing. Equal, say, that's what partnership means. I know what it means, he said. I'm making sure we mean the same thing by it. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, steady attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, and had never stopped meaning something. Equal standing, he said. Equal say. I wouldn't want it any other way. On the day the partnership papers were signed, Roy Cassidy put on the good coat he wore to church, which was the only formal gesture available to a man who expressed himself in work rather than ceremony. And he stood as witness with the simple dignity of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right thing to happen and is glad to see it arrive. Danny signed as second witness, which required him to be coached briefly on what that meant and resulted in a signature that used considerably more paper than strictly necessary. Harlan Bates sent a bottle of whiskey from Helena with a note that said only, "Well done." That evening, she and Caleb walked the fence line of the north pasture, the first fence they had worked together. The corner brace he had set properly, on the first day he had been on the property. It was solid. It would hold through another winter without needing attention. She had checked it twice, and both times it had needed nothing. She stopped at the corner brace and looked at it. The first thing you did on this ranch, she said. The first thing you let me do, he said. She thought about the woman who had been standing at that fence the day he rode up alone, blistered, fighting on 12 fronts simultaneously, telling herself she was fine when she was holding together by the thinnest thread. She thought about what it had cost to let someone in. What it had cost to trust, what it had cost to stand in her kitchen and say the words I've decided out loud to another person when she had spent 3 years deciding everything alone. She thought about her father and what he had known that she had needed to learn the longer way, that strength and help were not opposites. That the people worth trusting would not use your trust to make you smaller. That love and independence were not a trade you did not give one to have the other. The person everyone had called too wild to be loved was standing on her own land, in partnership with a man who had shown up on the first day and fixed the corner brace right, and who had stood beside her through everything that followed without once asking her to become someone she wasn't. He had not tamed her, he had not needed to, he had simply recognized her. And in being recognized, she had become more fully herself than she had ever been when she was fighting alone. She looked at Caleb in the evening light. He looked back at her with everything he was steady, honest, real, staying. You know what I was afraid of, she said, before you came. Tell me. I was afraid that the only way to survive was to need no one. She looked at the land around her, the cattle, the fence, the house her father had built. I thought needing someone was a door left open, something that could be used against me. And now? She turned back to him. Now I think I had it backward. She held his. Needing the right person isn't a weakness, it's the bravest thing there is. Because it means you believe they're worth the risk. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, You're worth every risk I've taken to be standing here. She took his hand, he held it. The Harper ranch stood behind them, solid and real, paid for in 3 years of refusal to quit, and 1 season of learning to trust, built first by a man who believed in his daughter, and kept going by the daughter who believed in herself, and finally, fully by 2 people who had decided that standing together was stronger than standing alone. The woman everyone said was too wild to be loved had found the one thing wilder than her spirit, a love that didn't ask her to surrender it. And the cowboy who had spent years moving through the world, looking for a reason to stop, had found, on a Montana fence line on a burning summer day, the only place he would ever need to be.